History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Pat McGuire, back with a very exciting episode today. But before we get to our topic and all things, we got to introduce everybody appearing on microphone today, starting with our co-host, broadcasting from his home studio today, Parker Russell. Welcome. How are you, big guy?
Doing pretty good.
Are you just doing good? You're sitting there in like one of the coolest rooms I've ever seen, and that was so low energy.
Well, I'm a little under the weather.
All right.
Almost had a medical event yesterday, so
that's why we're sitting in quarantine, so Parker doesn't bring the plague upon our house or your house. Or to our special guest, joining us in a triumphant return is one of my favorite storytellers we've ever had in the 5.5 years we've been doing this show. Kevin Duffus blew everybody's minds with what they actually don't know about the world's most famous pirate, Blackbeard. He's back today to blow our minds about the mystery and adventure and controversies surrounding one of the most unique pieces of history, one of the most unique pieces of maritime history, and that is specifically the Fresnel lens that sat upon the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse for a very long time. Kevin, welcome back to the show. How are you, dude?
It's been a long wait. I've been looking forward to this day.
See, Parker,
Absolutely.
Parker, bring Kevin energy. That's good energy.
I apologize.
Kevin, just want to start off with a big thank you for that epic Blackbeard episode. Once again, we've had so much feedback to it. People absolutely just could not understand that we based so much of what we thought we knew around so very little, and the story is actually so much more interesting. A little tidbit for you, in a connecting the dots to all these other things, we like shipwrecks on our show, and one of the stories we've told as far as shipwrecks was the steamship Home, which wrecked off of Wimble Shoals in 1837. And as we were going through the story and going through the names, we came across an interesting guy who had a last name of Salter. And I said, well, let's look into him real fast. And sure as shit, Kevin, this man is directly related to Edward Salter. He's one of the children of the guys that were at Charleston Harbor in the 1770s or 80s, I believe, or maybe he's a grandchild of them, but somebody that was on the SS Home was directly related to Edward Salter, and I realized that all of history is interconnected like a web.
Well, now you've taught me something, so I appreciate that, and I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so basically the short version there is, as the captain of the Home is debating whether or not he should make a run aground or not, or keep trying to push through this storm, as passengers on the ship, there are two other captains. They're on somebody else's boat, and these guys are like pressing him to beach the ship. And one of those two captains is this gentleman, Salter, whose first name I'm forgetting in the moment. But we looked him up just based on the last name, and we were like, I'll be damned.
Well, the Home actually went ashore on Ocracoke Island.
Yeah.
If we can ever coordinate our visits to the Outer Banks or to Ocracoke, I'll take you to the very spot. The boiler is still under the beach.
Wow.
And also this might undermine my credibility a little bit, but I went out there with two paranormal investigators who were claimed to be could use dowsing rods, or they could feel the spirit energy. And I didn't tell them why I took them out there. We're walking down the beach, and we were right in the vicinity of where the 90 people from the Home were buried. And they all of a sudden started getting real antsy. And one of the two women said, I can't stay here. We're surrounded by, I'm just being sort of swarmed by spirit energy.
Oh, I believe it.
And after we got back to my vehicle, I informed them, that's the spot where the Home came ashore. There's a great story from, my mentor was Outer Banks historian David Stick. And he told me, he said, Kevin, he said they used to say down on Ocracoke that pallbearers on the way to a funeral would drop a casket if they heard someone yell "ship ashore," because they'd all run out to the beach to see, what they could get for themselves.
Yeah.
Not to save lives.
No, there's money in salvage.
Right. So anyway, yeah, the home was a great, well, if you go out on a boat anywhere today in the United States and you put on a life preserver, you need to remember the steamship Home, because it was after that disaster that Congress passed the law that there has to be an equal number of life preservers for passengers aboard a vessel.
Yeah.
On lakes and sounds and rivers, and so it was all the result of the Home.
So connecting the history theme, we were talking about this. We in the same research, we learned that legislation you're speaking of right there was the most significant piece of maritime legislation up until they did it again after the wreck of Titanic. It was like by the time of Titanic, they were still operating on the precedent that the Home had set. So it's just, first of all, it takes tragedy to move needles apparently, which sucks. But we were like, oh, wow, like all of the serious stuff in 1912 was because of this 1837 wreck. No credibility undermined. Parker and I are into all sorts of weird stuff. There's alien books and posters on the other side of this camera here. I have seen dowsing rods work in real life. I've never been able to perfect the craft myself, but I have seen them used, and I'm very fond of a World War I story of Australian troops in Gallipoli surviving because of the use of dowsing rods. They found water, so I believe it.
It works. It works for me. I've used it. I don't know how it happens, but by the way, the two paranormal investigators, the reason why I had them on Ocracoke was we were actually looking at night. We were looking for the ghost of Blackbeard.
Yes.
So that kind of ties that together. And then back to the Home. The Home went right by the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. So there's our connection to today's topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it then, Kevin, because I've been waiting. I mean, I think we even talked about it at the end of the Blackbeard episode that we were going to have you back for this story. So let's just give our listeners just a brief background on sort of the Fresnel lens itself and its path to the Outer Banks, because it's got quite a story before it even gets put on top of the lighthouse. Why are we talking about the lens of a lighthouse and not the lighthouse as a whole? And are people even ready for this adventure? Do they need to wear seatbelts?
Oh, absolutely. They need to put on it. I mean, I think it's one of the greatest odysseys of American history. In fact, I want you to think, so I'm going to describe a Fresnel lens, and especially this particular lens, which was called a first order Fresnel lens. It was the largest of all the different lenses. And we'll get into the technical aspects of it, but I want you to think about the lens differently, not as an illuminating apparatus at the top of the lighthouse, but imagine a war veteran in a retirement home or sitting on a park bench out at a park, and people walk by, and having no idea who this individual is or what sort of experiences they had in wartime, and they're virtually ignored, and it's that's the way I think of the lens. I think of it as kind of an oracle of American history. It can teach you so much about history. It's not just about lighthouses. So that's the way I think of it. So just generally speaking, a Fresnel lens of the first order was reserved for the most important seacoast lights on the coast of America. You wouldn't find a first order lens in a harbor or on a river, or even a minor entrance to a major port. So there were different types of purposes for lighthouses. There were lighthouses that were intended to guide ships into a port or a harbor, and then there were lighthouses that were built and intended to warn ships away from a navigational hazard. And that was the case of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was located at what are called diamond shoals. It's a series of sandbars that extend 10 to 12 miles offshore. This was a heavily traveled sea passage, going all the way back to the 1500s. This stretch of water had been feared by mariners for hundreds of years, and so when after the Revolution, when the federal government finally began to take over the responsibility for marking harbors and aiding navigation, they identified Cape Hatteras as the most important place on the eastern seaboard for a lighthouse. So the first lighthouse built at Cape Hatteras was built. The construction started in 1798. The builder was a very famous American figure from the Revolution. He was an aide to George Washington, but Henry Dearborn was the builder of the original Cape Hatteras lighthouse, which was simply a 90-foot tall octagonal stone tower. And construction was completed in 1803, and immediately the lighthouse was too short to fulfill its mission, which was to be seen by ships passing beyond the end of Diamond Shoals.
That's kind of weak. They put in all that effort and then they're too short for it.
It was, well, they knew it was too short from the beginning, and the first mistake they made was, besides, well, that, you know, a 90-foot tall building in 1800 was a skyscraper.
Big deal, yeah.
That's a pretty big, and so, but the other thing is, the other mistake they made was they built this lighthouse. Well, they knew the lighthouse wasn't tall enough, so the surveyors went out to the Cape and they saw this 25-foot high sand dune. And they went, well, that would be the perfect place. We can add 25 feet to the focal plane of the light. And so that's where they built the lighthouse. What they didn't realize was that the sand dune was a migratory sand dune, like Jockey's Ridge, if you're familiar with Nag's Head on the Outer Banks. The sand dune was moving. And so over the next 60 years or so, the sand dune tried to move out from underneath the lighthouse. And so it caused all kinds of problems. There were many complaints. So originally the light in that lighthouse were a series of parabolic reflectors and oil lamps. They couldn't be seen very well. One navigator, around 1851, the federal government and Congress had heard so many complaints about the quality of American lighthouses that they conducted a survey. They interviewed a number of mariners. One mariner said, we'd be better off if you tore the lighthouse down because we're more apt to run ashore looking for it. We'd rather it not be there at all. And so that was 1851 was about the time that the federal government finally got serious about installing Fresnel lenses. Now, they had been around for quite a while. So the first Fresnel lens, which was built by this French physicist named Augustin Fresnel, he installed his first iteration of a Fresnel lens in a French lighthouse off the coast of Bordeaux, the Cordouan Lighthouse. Now, it's nothing like the Fresnel lens we're familiar with today that looks like this, a series of prisms and center bullseye panels and more prisms.
That's a cool model, Kevin. That's a cool model. Does it work?
Yeah, yes, there's a light in there. I don't know if I can get it on for you. But the first lens was actually a series of mirrors and a few prisms. Okay, so it didn't look anything like the one we have today. Nevertheless, first Fresnel lens, 1822, and then and unfortunately, Augustin Fresnel died just a few years later, 1827. But a number of other engineers over the next couple of decades made enormous number of improvements, and eventually the lens was all a series of prisms that would magnify and bend the light. By 1850, there were something like around the world 368 Fresnel lenses in lighthouses, but in the United States there were only 2, and they were experimental. We were very slow to adopt this new lighting technology. There's an explanation for that, but we don't.
Where were the 2 lenses?
At the Highlands in New Jersey, right just south of New York Harbor. There were 2 lighthouses, pretty much in the same spot, and one had a first order Fresnel lens, the other one had a smaller second order Fresnel lens. They were experimental. They were placed there just to see how well they functioned. By the way, those were the 2 first lenses, and nobody knows what happened to them. That's one of the remarkable things about it. So finally, by 1851, the federal government said, "Okay, we need to start, buying these lenses from France," and so they first ordered 2 first order Fresnel lenses. And now, just to give you a sense of the size of these things, the first order Fresnel lenses are the lens itself is about 12 feet tall. It's 6 feet wide. The Cape Hatteras lens was comprised of 1,007 crown glass prisms.
Whoa.
And the entire, so the lens itself weighed about 6,000 pounds. It was quite a large machine. Funny story. So the first of these two lenses was intended for a lighthouse down in Florida. Federal government ordered it from the manufacturer in Paris, Henri Lepeau Company. They shipped it over to New York, and then the government lost track of it. So it arrived at the Customs House in Manhattan, which is now the Federal Hall in the Wall Street district. They got all these crates from Paris, but nobody knew, what it was, and they stored it down in the basement of the Customs House. 2 years later, the customs collector went, "Well, what is all this stuff? We need to get rid of it." So they put it up for auction. They still didn't know what it was, and nobody even opened the crates. And a German guy bought the whole thing for like $500. And then when he opened it up, he went, "Oh my gosh, this is," it was a lighthouse lens. By the way, this was an identical lens to the lens we're going to be talking about, the Cape Hatteras lens.
Okay.
Well, the federal government got pretty upset that this guy bought their lens for $500 at an auction, so they ended up going to court, and there's no indication of what the settlement was, but the government got its lens back, and then it was shipped down to Florida, to this island south of Key West called Sand Key, and they dispatched a lieutenant in the topographical engineers, a man named Meade, to go down to Florida to assemble the lens.
Kevin,
he did.
I know when you do stuff like that you're leading us somewhere now. I think we're going to know this Meade.
Don't give it away.
I won't, but I could tell right away. As soon as you said that, I was like, here we go. We know this name.
This is an example of why I say that this lens is like an oracle, or if you like Lord of the Rings, a Palantir, where it can kind of show you the past and the future, and so they installed this first French lens down in Florida, and then 2 years later, the second lens arrives from Paris. The second, I call it the Henri Lepeau lens. It arrives in New York. This time, the customs collector knows what it is, and it is assigned to be installed at the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse down in North Carolina. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, as we already mentioned, was too short. So the government in 1853 decided to build an addition onto the top of the old 90-foot stone tower. They built another 25 feet of brick on top of that. And then on top of that was going to be the new lantern room and the new lens being this Henri Lepeau lens. At that same time, in 1853, the United States hosted its first World's Fair. It was an event that was very similar to a World's Fair that was held in London 2 years earlier. That was in a building called the Crystal Palace in London. It was very big news back then. And actually, at that Crystal Palace in London, a British lighthouse lens company displayed one of their lenses, and there's a great illustration of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert standing at the foot of this lens, looking up and admiring this lighthouse lens. So, in the United States, it was decided, well, we could do that too. So, and we have this new lens that just arrived from Paris. So the organizers of the Crystal Palace got permission to erect the lens. Well, there's only one man in the United States at the time who knew how to put one of these together. So up comes Lieutenant Meade, and he comes to New York, and in late August and early in September of 1853, this Lieutenant Meade constructs the lens. Now the lens becomes the most popular exhibit in the entire Crystal Palace. I mean, there are lots of other stuff. There were sculptures and all. And by the way, Elisha Otis demonstrated his elevator brake, an automatic elevator brake. Imagine how that changed the lives of New Yorkers. The fact that you could stop an elevator if it started to fall. But there were a number of other really remarkable inventions. But the one thing that drew everybody's attention was this incredible lighthouse illuminating apparatus. And so they lit it up at night and they dimmed the lights, and it was flashing its light all through this Crystal Palace. And um, it's a strange thing, but I have two ancestral connections to the lighthouse lens. And the first one is that in 1853, I had a great great grandfather. He was 10 years old at the time, and he lived in Manhattan with his family. And almost certainly I don't have evidence of this, but everybody in New York went to the Crystal Palace to see the World's Fair. So I'm very confident that he actually saw that. And Sam Clemens also saw the lens. Sam Clemens wrote a letter back to his sister in Hannibal, Missouri, saying that, you know, how amazing this fair was, and all of the artifacts and everything. So after a few months, in December, the lens was then dismantled so it could then be shipped down to Cape Hatteras to be installed in the new lighthouse. Now, all of this information I discovered after I published my book, The Lost Light. Yep. And so I ended up having to publish a third edition so I could add all of this information in there. And so when I found out that the lens had been at the Crystal Palace, I started doing image research at the Library of Congress, hoping that there might be, you know, a daguerreotype or some type of photograph or whatever. And all I could come up with was a lithograph that had been commissioned by, of all people, Phineas T. Barnum. Oh. And because he took over the management of the Crystal or the exhibition for the next year, and he wanted to create a poster that he could put in windows and stuff. And so I got a hold of this image, and when I first looked at it, it was a beautiful, beautiful photograph of the rotunda of the Crystal Palace. And in the center was this equestrian statue of George Washington, and facing westward, which was an important clue, because I knew that the lens was exhibited in the south nave right off of 42nd Street. By the way, if you're familiar with New York City, this was located at what is now directly behind the New York City Library, which is what now Bryant Park, which is where the Crystal Palace was in 1853. And so I had to get out a magnifying glass, but there in the south nave, I found the lens. I mean, I can't even describe what it feels like to be a researcher and a history detective and to discover something like that, because it is the first and only representation or photograph of the lens at that time.
That's got to be an awesome experience. I also have a thought, and you said, you know, there's all these inventions and pieces of art and beauty, but it's the light, it's the lens. Let me specifically say that people are like kind of drawn to. It's the thing they want to see. I'm wondering if it's because, you know, when you see these cheeky drawings from like 150, 160 years ago, when they're like, this is what life in like the year 2000 is going to look like, and it looks like this insane futuristic Victorian thing, kind of like steampunk. That's what this thing looks like. Like when you held that up, my first thought was like, in the 1850s, people were probably like, that's a spaceship. Like, shut up. That's not a light. Like, that's a spaceship.
Well, and I didn't even describe, I mean, I mentioned the characteristics of the glass part of the lens, but the lens actually was rotated by this clockwork mechanism, which was a maze and mass of gears and pulleys and weights, and that part of it also was just mind-boggling for the time.
How bright was it on that display? Because I know that, you know, you could see lights from, you know, ways away offshore. Here we are in this building and it's spinning. Are people just like, oh my God, I'm blind?
Well, it's a strange thing, but it's actually not as bright up close as it is 18 miles away.
Is that the magic of the lenses?
Yes, it's the way the light is focused, and so the closer you get to it, the less impressive it is in terms of its brightness.
How many watts, like doing like on a today's scale, how mmany watts roughly are those?
That's a great question. You know, I showed you, well, I do have 1,000-watt light bulb that actually came from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse.
Holy moly!
And this was from the 1990s, but I would say it was probably close to maybe 1,000 watts. Now, I failed to mention that one of the most important factors in the adoption of Fresnel lenses was prior to that, lighthouses, as I mentioned, were illuminated with 18 to 22 lamps and parabolic reflectors, and each one of those lamps had to be fueled and lit each night, and each parabolic reflector had to be cleaned because there was a lot of soot and film and grease, and so the change to the Fresnel lens meant that the lighthouse could be illuminated by a single oil lamp. In the case of Cape Hatteras, it had that particular lamp had 4 concentric wicks. Okay, but it was a single lamp with a single oil source, and it cut down the use of oil, which, prior to kerosene was generally spermaceti oil or whale oil.
Right.
And boy, those lighthouses went through. I mean, it cost the government a fortune in oil, and all that oil had to be delivered. And so now you've got a single light source. So the lens goes down to Cape Hatteras and gets installed in the lighthouse in 1854, the new elevated version of the lighthouse, and it works perfectly for 7 years. 7 years, and then
we go to war.
And we go to war. Okay, April 13th, right? 1861, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and here in North Carolina, at the Capitol building, a messenger from the telegraph office comes running in the building to the governor's office, and he just had received a telegram from Secretary of War Cameron, for the governor of North Carolina, saying, we are requesting North Carolina to provide 2,000 troops to help put down the Southern insurrection. The governor at the time was a man named John Ellis, and Ellis sent a telegram back to Cameron saying, you will get no troops from North Carolina. And so it was still going to be 6 weeks before, or I'm sorry, about a month before North Carolina seceded from the Union. But Governor Ellis had already made it clear that North Carolina was not going to participate. The very next thing he did was he sent out telegrams to the various lighthouse districts on the coast of North Carolina. And at the time, I think there were 6 or 7. Each group of lighthouses were managed by a local customs collector who served as sort of the lighthouse superintendent. And so they received these telegrams from Raleigh saying, cease lighting your lighthouses immediately. Okay, don't light them anymore. And the idea was that, the South did not have a Navy as such, and they fully expected the Union Navy to begin heading south and eventually to blockade southern ports. But Confederate authorities thought that by extinguishing the lights, that would inhibit the Union Navy from finding the coast of the various southern states, which didn't work at all.
Silly thought. Just a silly thought.
Very silly thought. So then North Carolina seceded on May 20th, and all of the federal property on the coast, military forts like Fort Macon down at Beaufort Inlet, and also down on the Cape Fear River, were transferred to the Confederate government. And the same with lighthouses. Lighthouses had been federal property, and now they were the property of the Confederate States of America. So by then, the government had been moved to Richmond, and they, under the Department of Treasury in Richmond, they formed a office of lighthouse, a lighthouse bureau, they called it. It's really funny. In my book, so all of my research, or most of my research, I did at the National Archives in Washington, and I found original handwritten correspondence from the Confederate Lighthouse Bureau, where it had a sole employee, one employee, and he took the federal stationery that said U.S. Lighthouse Bureau, and he scratched out U.S. and then wrote Confederate. They didn't print new stationery. They simply used
They were
government.
doomed from the start, brother, between railroads and no Navy. They don't even have fucking stationery of their own. They were doomed,
Right.
man.
Right. So, but they still had high hopes, and so they knew that extinguishing the lighthouses was not going to be good enough. So this official in the Confederate Lighthouse Bureau then sent out what's called a circular, which is basically a memo, same memo, but it goes out to all the different states, and it says we need you to dismantle the lenses in all of your lighthouses. All of the lighthouses need to now be disabled by removing the lenses and having the lenses moved somewhere safe in the interior. And of course, their intention was that they were going to eventually win the war, and they didn't want anything bad to happen to these lenses. They wanted them to be returned to the lighthouse at some point when the war ended. This is contrary to a myth. I am somewhat of a myth buster, as you know, and until I came along, the prevailing historical interpretation was that the Confederates shot out the lenses of the lighthouses and they tore them apart and buried them and all this stuff. And it's like that never made sense to me because these things were expensive.
So, quick question on this kind of subject. So, this isn't the only significant light in the Outer Banks at that time. Just up the coast, there is the Body Island light. Does it have one of these same Fresnel lenses? Is it under the same dismantle it and get it the hell out of their orders?
Yes. So the Body Island Lighthouse, and then there were a number of sound lighthouses called screw pile lighthouses that had fourth order lenses, which were much smaller. You could wrap your arms around a fourth order lens and carry it yourself. Body Island Lighthouse had a third order lens. In fact, we'll have to talk about my early adventures of when I started searching for, because we're going to get to this point where the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse vanishes into history, right? And
Right.
I have to find it. And so we'll get back to this. I found documents pertaining specifically to the Body Island Lighthouse.
Okay.
In fact, that was my first stepping stone that eventually led me to the whereabouts of the Cape Hatteras lens. But the Cape Hatteras lens, so all the lighthouses are ordered to be dismantled. And in June of 1861, a machinist from the town of Washington, which the locals like to call the original Washington, but it's a small town on the Pamlico River, about 65, 70 miles west of Cape Hatteras. A machinist and the local lighthouse superintendent go out to Cape Hatteras, and they work with the keeper of the lighthouse and dismantle the lens. Now, dismantling the lens is a very complicated procedure. Now, it can all be taken apart so each one of these is a panel that can be removed. But what you have to do, if you know what you're doing, is you take out one on this side, then you take out one on this side, because the whole machine needs to be kept in balance.
Right.
You don't want it to start getting lopsided or whatever. So they knew what they were doing.
You said 6,000 pounds. That's why the weight balance is important, right?
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Here's a photograph in my book, and there's a lighthouse keeper polishing, and this is exactly a first order Fresnel lens. That's exactly what the Cape Hatteras lens would have looked
huge.
Like. So they removed the lens. The whole thing, probably back then, they strung up a trolley line on the outside of the lighthouse, and they lowered each panel. The largest panels of prisms weighed about 175 pounds each. They got them to the ground. They packed them in cotton-lined pine crates, and then took them out to a dock or a wharf where there was a steamboat or steam vessel waiting, and they shipped it to the town of Washington. So the lens is removed, and I'm going to kind of shift gears here because I'm giving you Civil War history. I had in the 1990s, I was also a documentary filmmaker, had worked in television, and I produced two documentaries on the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. One was on the history, and then the second one was how that lighthouse was moved a half a mile in 1999, which is pretty remarkable. Mm-hmm. And so I had already, I was very familiar with what a lighthouse lens was. And I was thinking about producing a documentary on the history of Civil War in North Carolina. A book that I turned to, and most people who are familiar with North Carolina Civil War history is this one by John Barrett, a fantastic historian. And in this book, I was reading it, and there's a footnote at the bottom of the page, and it describes the reason why Union forces captured the town of Washington on the Pamlico River, and it was to recover the lenses from the Hatteras light, which, according to John Barrett, had been taken farther up inland up the Tar River to this town called Tarboro. And another author wrote that that was the last anyone had heard of it. And so in around 1999, this really piqued my interest. In fact, a magazine said that no one ever knew what became of the lens of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Now, I thought that was pretty remarkable. This is a big thing, you know, as we said, it's 6,000 pounds.
But it's not unheard of in history, Kevin. As soon as you said that, you know, that the way you said it, like kind of disappeared into history. Like if you're familiar with World War II history, the Amber Room. I mean, it's this famous room that was in one of the Russian palaces that just disappeared. And to this day, as we're talking, where is it? Nobody knows, right? This massive thing. So there's a precedent for things just disappearing like that.
The sarcophagus that came out of the third of the pyramids of Giza was put on a ship. They took it out of Menkare's pyramid and they put it on a ship, and wouldn't you know it, that ship sank. So this is a pretty significant piece of history that is now, of course, just lost and just eaten up by the ocean, right? So
exactly. So I kind of took it upon myself. I thought, okay, the lens has to be somewhere, and so this was going to be my new project. And I guess maybe I thought of myself sort of as an Indiana Jones, because the lens there was a series of letters, handwritten letters from 1862, and this was shortly after the town of Washington was captured. By the way, the lens had been moved to Washington and had been placed in a warehouse on the waterfront, owned by this man named John Myers. And so I made a few trips up to Washington, up to the National Archives in DC, the archives on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I found a letter from John Myers to the Confederate government in Richmond saying that I have taken the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse and moved it up to Tarboro. And by the way, the Yankees back in Washington, who just captured the town, threatened to burn down the town of Washington if the lens is not returned. They also intend to capture my steamboat, and they said they're going to sink my steamboat if I don't bring the lens back. So this is, pretty serious business. So I followed through a series of letters. I traced the lens to this little village on the North Carolina-Virginia border called Townsville, to a plantation called Hibernia Plantation. And through research, I located what would have been Hibernia Plantation. Unfortunately, half of Hibernia Plantation today is submerged under a huge reservoir called Carr Lake. And so I was thinking, well, that's going to be difficult, because if the lens was buried up there somewhere, and if it's under the lake, that's going to be really hard to find. But the other interesting clue is there were a number of mines in this Townsville area. And it was a very well-known mining area. And so some other writers had speculated that maybe the lens had been hidden in a mine. So I lived at the time in Raleigh, and about 60 miles south. So I started making trips up on weekends and searching for these mines, again, with visions of finding the entrance to a mine that had been forgotten for 100 years. And I'm going to open up the entrance, and there's going to be sitting this beautiful, shining, and I'm going to hear music.
It's going to be fully assembled for no reason at all. Well lit,
gleaming. Right. Just like Indiana Jones, right? So, I never found. Oh, and it turned out that mines were tungsten mines that were built in the early 1900s, and that's not what would have happened to the lens. So then I started making trips back to DC, to the National Archives, and I realized that possibly somewhere in that huge building would be the answer. And it took a number of years and a number of trips to Washington. In 2002, in the spring of 2002, a national magazine called Lighthouse Digest, the editor in that magazine published this statement that the whereabouts of the Cape Hatteras lens remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of American lighthouse history. And at that time, I was within 2 months of finally finding the evidence to prove that, I knew the location of the lens. In fact, I kept tracing, getting closer and closer, and then I had to start researching letters from the Civil War. And on one of my trips in the summer of 2002, I was going through a box of index slips, which are basically references to another document that's located somewhere else in the archives. So these are index slips that refer to letters that had been written during the Civil War. And I found one that said that reported that the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was reported to have been found in Raleigh. This is in 1865. Okay, found by none other than General Sherman's Signal Corps. Okay, after they captured Raleigh at the end of the war.
Nice.
Well, boy, did I get excited about that. And I went to the archivist, and at the bottom of the index slip, it said it's in letter book 267, page 500 and something. So I said, I need you to pull this record for me. And she looked at me and she just immediately shook her head and said, I'm sorry, but that letter book was burned in a fire in the 1920s.
Oh, I thought you was going to say, no, I'm sorry, that's classified. And then the mystery thickens. You're like,
right.
It is aliens.
So at the same time, I had also found it was actually a clipping from the Philadelphia Inquirer, written by a correspondent who was traveling with Sherman's army during his march through the South, that when they arrived in Raleigh, they found in the rotunda of the Capitol building in downtown Raleigh a vast pile of lighthouse lenses. Okay, and you combine that with this index slip that the Hatteras lens was reported to be in Raleigh. Now, what actually happened was, as General Sherman came up the main street, which was called Fayetteville Street at the time, marched up. He looked up at the dome of the Capitol, and the Confederate States flag was flying over the dome of the Capitol. And he told the head of his Signal Corps, "Get your men up there, get up there, and get that flag down, and put the stars and stripes up there." And so that's how they discovered this fact that the rotunda of the Capitol had been the secret hiding place of almost all of North Carolina's lighthouse lenses throughout the war. By the way, General Burnside, a number of generals had been searching for lighthouse lenses through the whole war. Every time they captured a town, they started looking for it and never did find the Hatteras lens.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So Sherman finds these, right? I'm just so I'm not confused. This is pretty definitive at this point. Like in 1865, we knew where they were, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, we knew what they were.
Right. So here's my question. How do they not immediately start going back to the lighthouses? Because at this point, the war is wrapping down real quick. The U.S. has had the coasts. I'm pretty sure Lee has surrendered by the time Sherman's in that part of North Carolina, or he's very near to. How do these just not immediately start going, well, boys, ship them back to the coast, and then they get immediately reassembled? Like, how do they even get to disappear?
They couldn't. Well, first of all, they couldn't send them immediately back at the end of the war because, first of all, there were about 120 Fresnel lenses throughout the South, from the coast of Virginia all the way down to Texas. And there were, again, all those lenses had to be recovered. Some of them were discovered to have been damaged. I think one down in Florida was buried in the sand, but they were very delicate precision optical instruments, and they all had to either be sent back to a lighthouse depot on Staten Island, New York, where they had these lampists and engineers who could recalibrate the lens. They had to be adjusted so that they would work. I love this story, but I don't want to get too far ahead here, but the lenses, when they were focused, they had to be focused. Okay, all the prisms had to be adjusted so that the light, all came out in a single beam. And what they would do is they would hang a red ball in the middle of the lens at the point of the focal plane, and then an engineer would step back hundreds of feet away, and if he could see the red ball in all of the prisms, then they would know that it was perfectly adjusted. But Sherman's army, of course, finds this pile of lighthouse lenses. This then now introduces, when you're a researcher and you're traveling back in time on a trail that no one else has been on. You're discovering things that no one has seen or knows about, and so everything is a surprise. And so it happened that I was at the National Archives, and I found the index reference, and of course the record was actually burned. It was a letter to someone in the government, or either a military officer or the Lighthouse Board. So I started researching additional documents. I came across a record that another U.S. Army general, Montgomery Meigs, I don't know if the name is familiar to you.
Yeah, Quartermaster General.
Quartermaster General. Okay. At the
Founder
National Archives, I found this letter from General Meigs to Washington. And it was from the city of Raleigh. Okay. This is now, it's April of 1865. Okay. Sherman is engaged or involved in negotiating the surrender with General Joe Jackson in Durham, and he's traveling back and forth. And President Lincoln became concerned that Sherman was giving away too much. He was conceding too much to the South, and he wanted to sort of straighten him out. So he sent a special delegation down to Raleigh. Now, Sherman, if you can picture this, Sherman's sound asleep, and he confiscated the governor's mansion. Okay, the governor's gone. The Confederate governor, he's out of town.
Yeah.
Sherman takes over, and there's a knock on the door, and I guess Sherman's assistant or whatever wakes him up and said, "Sir, there's someone here to meet with you." It was like 6 a.m, and Sherman goes to the door, and there, standing there, is General Grant and General Meigs. Lincoln sent Grant down to Raleigh and to straighten Sherman out. It's like, okay,
hey, enough.
We don't like how we don't know how you're negotiating this.
Yeah.
Well, Meigs was sent. He's the Quartermaster General. Meigs was sent to the Capitol to supervise the repacking and the shipping of all these lighthouse lenses. Meigs walks into the Capitol, and a bunch of laborers, are wrapping these lenses with paper that they found on the floor of the Capitol. Well, the paper turned out to be, Meigs looks down and he sees original documents signed by Thomas Jefferson.
Oh my God.
George Washington. These are the colonial records of North Carolina that got scattered. The Confederates, when they evacuated the Capitol and the governor, they went through all the records and took out anything of military value, and anything that didn't have to do with the war, they just tossed on the floor. One of the documents that got tossed on the floor, by the way, was North Carolina's copy of the Bill of Rights.
Wow.
Which was found by a Ohio soldier who rolled it up and stuffed it under his coat. And that's a whole other story. And my research played a small part in North Carolina's recovery of that document. There was a sting operation by the FBI. It happened in Philadelphia. I can't remember where you're located.
We're outside. We're sort of in this like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, DC. Yeah. We're right outside like Frederick, Maryland.
Okay. Oh, I'm very familiar. I used to live in Hagerstown back in the early 60s.
All right. Well, we're between Frederick and Westminster, if you know the area precisely.
I know it so well. I mean, my dad actually, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, worked at Raven Rock Mountain. He was under the mountain.
Continuation of government site. We know about that around here.
Absolutely. So back to the Capitol, and Meigs looks down and he sees all these documents, and then he goes and he writes this letter back to Washington saying that when these lighthouse lenses and all these crates and boxes show up, you need to get someone with some intelligence to go through the wrapping paper and to recover and preserve, anything to do with Thomas Jefferson. And, it's really quite remarkable. So, I'm at the National Archives, and I find the archivist who's in charge of all Civil War records. You would know his name. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it's in the book because I write about this. And I say, could you I need to find some more information about General Meigs when he was in Raleigh. And he went, oh, General Meigs was not in Raleigh, during the war. He was too busy. He was the quartermaster general, he was here in Washington the whole time. And I said, well, I've got a copy of a letter that he wrote from Raleigh. And he said, let me see that, and it's like, well, that was a major revelation to the senior archivist in charge of Civil War records, because he didn't even know that.
Oh, that's cool.
So that we eventually found a document that said that there was only one first order Fresnel lens found by Sherman's Signal Corps in the Capitol Rotunda, and it was not the Cape Hatteras lens. It was the lens from the Cape Lookout Lighthouse, which was the only other lighthouse in North Carolina during the war that had a first order Fresnel lens. So in the course of my research, now I discover, well, the lens is still missing.
Oh,
right?
No, bummer.
But the remarkable thing is the war ended and 5 months pass. Now I'm going through records, the war ends and I'm searching through all records of May 1865, June, July, August. Now, all these other lenses from all across the South are all being discovered. And I'm finding letters, oh, we got the letter from Biloxi, or the lens from Biloxi, we got the letter, from Tampa, the lens from Tampa. But nothing about the Cape Hatteras lens until September of 1865. And in the National Archives, I find this letter saying that the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was discovered in this town of Henderson, which was just about 20 miles from where it was hidden on Hibernia Plantation. This is in September of 1865. So the men, it was a physician from the town of Washington and his father-in-law who had hidden the lens throughout the Civil War. Another revelation I thought was pretty remarkable is that when the war ended and Sherman's army disbanded in Raleigh, or the different units went their separate ways, the 14th Corps and 20th Corps marched north of Raleigh back to Washington, D.C. for the victory parades, and they marched right through Hibernia Plantation. They went there, 28,000 soldiers. And the stories of Sherman's army, they left no stone unturned when they traveled. There's a lot of guys you got to feed and everything. And I traced a descendant of the owner of Hibernia Plantation who told me, she said, I remember my great-great-grandfather telling me that he remembered, or no, his great aunt, this great aunt who said that when the Yankees were on the plantation, one of them tried to steal her watch and she had to beat him off with a stick. And I thought, well, gosh, Yankees, it doesn't take much to, discourage a Yankee, I guess. But
they won the war. Calm down, Kevin. They did win the war. Okay. I'm just kidding.
You're right. But I realized it's like, well, they were hiding something more important than her watch and I eventually deduced or hypothesized that the place they hid the lens, I did find up in Hibernia Plantation, this large hole in the ground, which turned out to be, the descendants told me that was what was in 1865 the ice house for the plantation. So it's this wooden structure with a deep hole, and they would, in the wintertime, they would saw blocks of ice from the Roanoke River, and they would bury them in sawdust, and then they would keep their perishables in this building. Well, I realized it's like, what a great place to hide a lighthouse lens, because if they hid all those crates underneath piles of sawdust and blocks of ice, the melting ice wouldn't have harmed the lens,
right?
Because it was all bronze and glass. 28,000 soldiers were not able to find the lens, but then the doctor and his father-in-law, relocated the lens. I think it was in fact during tobacco harvest time, and I think they probably transported the lens by wagons down to Henderson, and it was all stacked up at the train station. So a detachment of Union cavalry who were, occupying North Carolina at the time found the lens. The lens was sent back to New York to the Staten Island depot. And then now I'm back on the trail again. I lost the trail. It's like searching your way through a wilderness where you lose the trail, and then you re-find it. And then, now I'm finding all sorts of information. The lens was sent back to Paris in 1868 and to be repaired. There were some prisms that had to be replaced because they were chipped or whatever.
Was George Meade not available to fix it?
George Meade was, he was. By then, the government had probably hundreds of lighthouse lampists, they were called, not engineers at that point. So the lens came back to the United States 2 years later.
On this show, we have to ask, when George Meade shows up, wherever he assembled that lens on, was it good ground?
Go, Parker. Parker makes the same terrible Gettysburg joke, Kevin, anytime it's available. Like, even
I
if
appreciate it.
if it's an arm's reach, he's like, I'm going to grasp right for it. Hey, before we continue, Kevin, I'll tell you why I'm not surprised why 28,000 Yankees can't find this thing as they're marching right over it, basically. Ready? What's the name of the plantation?
Hibernia.
The guy, they're Irish. They're clever. They're shisty people. There's no chance you're going to trick an Irish person.
No.
Right, exactly. Unless the British are doing it for 700 years. Never mind.
By the way, that plantation is now a state park, and that hole in the ground is still there. And the father-in-law, Colonel John Hargrove, I found his grave. I actually used to go visit his grave and ask him if he would tell me where he hid the lens. And I never really got a response from him. But
you got to shoot all the shots, Kevin. That's a good move. That is a good move.
Absolutely. So I actually had started writing the book, The Lost Light, before I had even found the final piece of evidence that I needed to prove the fate of the Cape Hatteras lens. Now, I knew that it had survived the war. I knew it went to Staten Island. I knew that it was repaired in Paris and then sent back for the purpose of being installed in a new lighthouse somewhere on the coast of America. But I didn't know which one. Now, it wasn't too hard to make a list of about 12 possible destinations for the lens. And then I started researching from present time backward the history of each of those lighthouses to see if I could find the other end of the trail from that direction. And there was one lighthouse in particular that I had hoped that the lens had not been shipped to, because I knew that lens had a very terrible fate, that it would eventually be ravaged by souvenir hunters. So without giving that away just yet, I had started writing the book. I was about halfway through the book, still didn't have the answer to the mystery, but I was confident that I would find it. And I decided to make one last trip to the National Archives. I was up there for 2 days. It's expensive going to DC. You can't stay too far out of town, because if you're going to go to the archives, you got to be there first thing in the morning.
We live here. We know it's expensive to live here.
It's and at that point, it really cost me, a lot of money to do all this research with no promise of any sort of recompense or anything. And no grant money, no university supporting me or anything like that. And so my last trip was on a Wednesday and Thursday. And I spent 8 hours on Wednesday going through all these letter books after the Civil War. Now I'm up in the year 1870, and still had not found it. And because our research is expensive, I sat there in the reading room one time. I sat for 6 hours straight without getting up, without going to the bathroom, no water or whatever, because you're going through document after document, and you've got to make the most of your time. Now it's Thursday. Thursday passes. Now, one reason why I picked Wednesday and Thursday is at that time, the reading room at the archives was kept open on Thursday nights until 9 o'clock. So now I got extra hours. They don't close. And next thing I know, it's like 8:30 Thursday night, and there are only 2 researchers left in the reading room and the security guard. And then it's like 8:50. And the other researcher is gone, and it's just me and the security guard. And he says, sir,
you got to go.
We got to go.
Yeah.
And by then I've got this letter book in front of me, and I'm just flipping page after page. And by the way, I decided to search a group of records that no one had ever bothered to look at before, because it had nothing to do with North Carolina or Cape Hatteras. They were the records of what was called the 3rd Lighthouse District, which included the Staten Island Depot. And I knew that lenses are going in and out of the depot. And if there's any record of what happened to the lens that came back from Paris, by the way, the crates were marked Hatteras, so it was identified, that I might find it in those records. And on that particular evening, it was the summer of 2002, and across the street, across Pennsylvania Avenue, there is the Navy Memorial. And there, on that particular summer, there was a live concert of a Marine band performing patriotic songs. And all the while I'm doing this research, and I'm hearing through the windows, amongst the sirens of vehicles going up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, but all these beautiful songs, and then it's like 9:05, and they're playing America the Beautiful. and the security guard now is standing over behind me.
This
saying,
dude can't stand you. And he's like, come on, man. He's like, my shift is ending. Like, let's go.
I need a beer. I want to go home and have a beer. And my shoulders kind of slumped, and I thought, okay, this is it. I can't come back up here again. And then all of a sudden I heard this voice in my head. It said,
steal the book. It said, steal the book, right?
Yeah, steal the book. Yeah, like who was Clinton's national security advisor who rolled up documents and stuck them in his socks.
Yes.
I can't remember these. Well, this book was too big to stick in my sock. So, but I heard this voice that said, turn one more page. And I turned one more page, and there was a letter. It was a fair copy of a letter that had been sent to this lighthouse engineer in Baltimore saying, we're sending you the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse to be returned to Cape Hatteras to be installed in the new 1870 Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, where the construction of which was in the process of being completed. So the lens was sent back to where it came from, but it was not put back in the same lighthouse. And so that solved the mystery. Now I knew the rest of the story. The Henri Lepauvre lens that had been in the Crystal Palace, 1853, second Fresnel lens brought to America, and then resided at the top of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse until 1936. Erosion at Cape Hatteras had become so severe that there was fear that the ocean would wash away the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, undermine it. The lighthouse would fall over. And so the government abandoned the lighthouse. The Coast Guard basically decommissioned it, and then they built this steel tower and put this aviation beacon at the top of that, and that became the new Cape Hatteras Lighthouse.
All right, so let's do some intersecting of things real quick. So just because I need my brain to kind of catch all the wires into one place here. So did you say it comes through Baltimore on its way back to Hatteras?
Yes.
Oh, so
yes.
It's got a little hometowny for us. That's cool. Maryland's got its fingerprints on this. Take that, Maine,
yeah.
Parker. Parker's from Maine. Maine has nothing to do with this story.
Actually,
no, you got this. Does Maine have something to do with the story, Kevin?
No.
Okay,
Maine
good.
Has nothing to do with the story.
Okay, good.
Oh. I'll see you later, boy.
Actually, all of the construction of the modern Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, the one everybody's familiar with, it's the tallest lighthouse in America, the one that was moved, but the barber pole stripes, black and white stripes. That lighthouse was originally 1.2 million bricks, okay, that all went through Baltimore.
That's right. Made it to Baltimore Brick Works. Let's go.
Right. All those bricks were sent down to Cape Hatteras to make the lighthouse.
Wait, so my second question is, so the light makes it then, the light is reinstalled in Hatteras. So at this point, we've had it come to America, make its way, be installed, be dismantled, disappear, cross the ocean, do all this random stuff, find it, and then they've put it back on the Hatteras Tower. I'm saying the reason I brought to the I want to connect all these wires is because this is about the same time the Civilian Conservation Corps is on the Outer Banks, and they're doing a lot of the erosion work, like they're building the modern dune systems. Obviously it's kind of ironic that we're at this point in the story because without directly saying it, it's kind of this moment right before they're moving the lighthouse in our lifetime, water erosion and things like that brought you to this story that, here we are in the 1930s that they're like, look, this moving living island has put this tower in danger again. Is it the Civilian Conservation Corps that build that light tower, that sort of steel structure that they go to?
No, that actually, no. I mean, the Civilian Conservation Corps were more concerned with erosion control measures, the dunes. By the way, so in the 1930s and even 1940s, there was no paved road going down the Outer Banks. Okay, it was all sand, and there were no dunes. I mean, the dunes, if there were any dunes, they were generally migratory dunes. They were natural dunes, but they were not barrier dunes. So if you drive down to Hatteras Island today, you go across the Oregon Inlet Bridge, and you get on the north end of Hatteras Island, you can't see the ocean anymore because there's this 25-foot high mound of sand that runs, the whole length of Hatteras Island.
It feels so good to drive against, though, Kevin. I do. Like, my stress melts away when I'm driving along that dune wall. I'm like, I know where I am, brother.
But imagine this, that there was a time when that dune wall wasn't there at all. And so you're driving down the beach and you could see the ocean. It was much different. And the profile of the island itself was much flatter. So, but we wanted to, have a road. Okay. Back then, the road was called Highway 101, which this old timer on Hatteras told me it was 101 different ways to go. You just got on the tracks of someone else who had also driven ahead of you, and you just follow those tracks. So they built this paved road, but the only way to keep the paved road in place and to keep it from being undermined by ocean overwatch was then to build this barrier dune system, which then accelerated erosion. And that's when erosion really began to encroach on the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. So now, we're 1936, the lighthouse is decommissioned. Then we have 1942, World War II, and German U-boats, are waging war just within view of miles of the beaches there. And the lighthouse, by the way, during World War II was sort of used as a lookout post. And the lens was still up there, this very historic lens. And I got to jump back real quick. And before the lighthouse was decommissioned, I think this was in 1933, National Geographic sent a photographer down to the Outer Banks to take photographs for a major cover story that they were going to publish about, the uniqueness of the North Carolina Outer Banks. And the photographer, a man named Clifton Adams, took a photograph of the keeper of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse polishing the lens. And it's a very well-known photograph. It's been published many times. And what's really remarkable about it, I'm trying to find it as I'm talking. Here it is.
Oh yeah, very familiar with that image.
Yes.
Well, that lighthouse keeper did not know that he was polishing the lens that his great-great-grandfather removed during the Civil War.
Whoa.
His great-great-grandfather was the keeper in 1861 who removed that very same lens. He had no idea that
it's the same glass. Like, not that it's even like the same, it's the physical same.
Absolutely. But he didn't know that at the time, unfortunately. And so during World War II, there was also a great deal of discussion about who was going to be responsible for the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. This is about the time the National Park Service or the idea of establishing the Cape Hatteras seashore, national seashore, came to be. The father of my mentor, David Stick, an artist named Frank Stick, was the one who conceived the idea of establishing a park there. But the Coast Guard didn't want the lighthouse, so the government decided to transfer the lighthouse to the National Park Service. But during this time, there was a lot of back and forth between the two government agencies as to who was going to be responsible for the building. In the meantime, they left the door unlocked, open. And because the lighthouse had been decommissioned and no one thought that it was going to survive erosion, souvenir hunters started going up in the lighthouse and started prying out prisms from this lens.
So they physically left the door on. Like, that wasn't like hyperbole. That wasn't a metaphor. That was like the actual door to the tower is unlocked.
Exactly.
Well, that's convenient.
And over a period of years, the first thing that came out was the first thing that came out of the lens were two of the center flash panels on opposite sides. I believe that, and I believe those were probably taken by the family of the last keeper of the lighthouse, because it was taken by someone who knew they needed to take them out on opposite sides. But then all of a sudden, boy, prisms started going fast, to the extent that by 1950, 2/3 of the glass of that lens was missing. And also by 1950, the government realized that erosion had seemed to reverse itself. And so the Coast Guard decided to move the light of the lighthouse back to the tower, the brick tower. And so they put in what was more or less a rotating aviation beacon. So the lens didn't function as a lens anymore. So they had that dismantled, and they gave it to the Park Service, which stuck it in, over the years, it was stored in various buildings and warehouses and so forth. When I said that I had researched the fates of all the different possible lenses that, I already knew where the lens was at that point. And where it was when I was doing the research was in a warehouse at the it's the National Park Service Fort Raleigh National Historic Site on Roanoke Island, and so I went and met with the National Park Service historian, and we went and opened the door and went, and sure enough, there was the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse.
Kevin, is this, you mentioned Indiana Jones earlier. Is this room that you're talking about where you find it like that big crated room in the Indiana Jones movies? Like where it's just like the camera for our viewers is like way up here, and here's you and the NPS historian walking. There's this huge, and there's just like this crate, and it like right next to it says Ark of the Covenant. Like, are you in that room?
No.
Oh.
I wish I could leave you with that idea. You know?
Okay.
And then I would also say I could hear a choir singing. You know,
right.
When I walked in.
Exactly.
No, it was a smaller building, and I have photographs of what it looked like when I saw it there, and it was really rather sad knowing how historic this artifact was. Now, as I was being escorted through this building, we did have to go around what was a sewing machine, and next to the sewing machine was also this propeller, and I stopped and asked the Park Service ranger, I looked at the sewing machine and I said, "That's not what I think it is it?" And he goes, "Yep, that's the Wright brothers sewing machine."
What?
And the propeller was one of the propellers that hit the sand, and it kind of broke off the end of it, you know. So in a way, it is kind of like the Indiana Jones Ark of the Covenant.
That's warehouse. So cool, though, man.
So I was able to finish writing the book and publish the book. And I had been on the board of directors of the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, and then I became the chairman of the board of the museum. But we petitioned the National Park Service to allow us to recover what was left of the lens. We hired the nation's, there are only 4 men in America today that are considered lampists, Fresnel lens lampists. And we hired this gentleman named Jim Woodward. First of all, he came in on a sort of a survey to look at the lens, and he confirmed, he looked at it, and I showed him the images and the drawings of it from 1853, and he said, "Yeah, that's there's only one lens that has that configuration." He said, "That's the lens. That's the 1853 lens."
Are you just shitting your pants with excitement at this point? You're like, "Oh my God, dude, like I did it. Like I found this thing."
Like
it's okay to be excited, right?
If I ever came close to soiling my britches, is another way to put it.
Pardon me.
When the news, no, that's okay. The news came out that the lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse had been found, and I was in Raleigh driving, and I had my radio tuned to the NPR station, which at the time I listened to. I heard them announce my name. It's like this is breaking news. The lens from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse has been located after 140 years. This great mystery is solved by Kevin Duffus or whatever. And it's like, that's really surreal to
it's like hearing your song on the radio. Parker and I are musicians,
exactly.
Right? That's like, imagine us cranking out a single and finally hearing them be like, here's the top hit from the History Podcast Boys. Like we'd be freaking out, right? So that's what I mean. Like,
absolutely.
I'm somebody who personally believes it's okay to be proud of your work. You don't have to be braggadocious about it, but like if you work really hard on something, it's okay to feel the joy of its success. Like if you get it there. So I just, you've worked for a really long time. This has been quite a journey. I just wanted to know, were you stoked? Sounds like you were.
I was, but and there's a lot more to tell, of course, but and some very strange connections that I have with that lens, and in a strange way, and it's the same way with my research and work on Blackbeard. I inadvertently became a part of the lens's history. So with Blackbeard, of course, I discover the skeletal remains of one of his crew members, Edward Salter, and then I spend years trying to see that those bones are, respectfully reburied as was his wish. And so, now I'm part of that history. So in the case of the lens, of course, we petitioned the National Park Service to allow us to recover the lens and to have it reconstructed and put on display at the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, which we accomplished. We did in 2005. And then the next year, I thought, the lens itself is impressive, but it's not as impressive as if it was standing on or sitting atop its cast iron pedestal that was still remaining at the top of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Now, this was I'm one of those very optimistic, people that, have big dreams and visions. And it's like, there's nothing that you can't accomplish, if you really put your mind to it. So I wrote a letter to at the time, the superintendent of the Park Service of the Cape Hatteras seashore, saying that we really want to return the pedestal to the lens and to make it look like it should, appear. Well, this particular superintendent, I met him for lunch, and he said, I have to tell you that in my 35-year career at the Park Service, that's the most ridiculous thing anybody's ever asked me to do. There's no way that we are ever going to remove that pedestal from the top of the lighthouse. Now, the pedestal itself is also about, 10 feet high. It's made of cast iron, lots of intricate parts. The clockwork mechanism that rotated is all a part of it. It was at the top of the lighthouse, and it was covered in something like, 20 coats of battleship gray surplus Navy paint. It was all bronze and brass, and when it was polished, it was absolutely beautiful and painted. Parts of it were painted this beautiful forest green, but now, it's being neglected. It wasn't being interpreted. People were allowed to go to the top of the lighthouse, but they're ushered right by the pedestal, and nobody tells them what it was or how it functioned, or, so fortunately, that superintendent was about a year later was replaced. And when the new superintendent came in, I resubmitted our petition. He spent a lot of time considering it, did a couple of public meetings to see how the public felt about it. And so the decision was to allow us to recover that pedestal. But he said there was one condition, and that was that the pedestal had to be lowered down the interior of the lighthouse. Okay, now we couldn't do it the way they got it up there, which was using a trolley line, hoisting it up the outside. And so the whole thing had to be taken apart. Now, if you've been inside the lighthouse, it has this spiral staircase. There's not a lot of room for, maneuvering large pieces of cast iron. And the largest piece was the base, which weighed 850 pounds. And we actually had to remove a cast iron door just below the lantern room to be able to fit the base through that. And then the whole base had to be lowered step by step. It took 10 hours in one day to get it from the top of the lighthouse to the bottom, rolling it basically very gently, one step at a time, using a chain hoist that came down from the top of the lighthouse.
I can't believe you're operating in that space. I have been inside that tower more times than I can count with my lifetime of being down there on that island, and that is not, you have no room for error in there. You're going to bang the walls. You're going to hit something. It's
a 20-story building, and yes, it was that was quite an operation. In fact, on one day I actually climbed that lighthouse 10 times because I was filming it. I was thinking about doing a documentary.
Dear God, did they give you a medal for that? Do you have a medal that says you did that?
No, but so now the lens and the pedestal are reunited, and they're they were on display in the lobby or the entrance of the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum. So when you walk through the doors, first thing you see, it's now 22 feet high. It's quite a remarkable display.
And that's how I came to it in life, Kevin. Like when I first time I went there as a kid, it was right there in the lobby. It was, it's disgustingly impressive. You can't take your eyes off of it. It dominates the whole room, and it deservingly so. It's beautiful.
Yeah, but I've described it also in some of the things that I've written as like a toothless war veteran. It's like 600, more than 600 of the prisms are missing.
Well, sure.
But again, I think that as it appears, it still has a story to tell. It's like I think it's much more informative than a complete intact lens, that was never traveled like this one. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean, 3 times.
I thought it was a time machine. When I was a kid, Kevin, I thought it was a time machine. Like when I was like a little kid and I saw it, I was like, holy, like That's awesome. That's
Wow.
why I said like it looked like that's why when I said the people of the World's Fair were probably like, well, this looks like a spaceship because like here's me, you know, I'm like 10 years old. I'm not really reading interpretive signs yet. I'm just kind of there with my parents, and I'm like, wow, that looks like a time machine. Like I could travel in that thing.
Right, that famous Jules Verne drawing.
Kind of.
Is it him that I'm thinking of?
I don't know. I mean, I know the drawing you're thinking of. I don't know who the artist is, but yeah. So that's why, like, when
But
you're here at this moment, Kevin, I'm like, I'm awed by it. The toothless war veteran that is this light. Yeah, like, look at that.
And that's me. That was the night that we completed the reassembly of the lens and the pedestal. That's me standing there. Um, and you mentioned the interpretive panels. So, being the chairman of the museum at the time, I decided to go ahead and write. I'm a writer, so I wrote the text on 4 interpretive panels to kind of tell the story, the history, the Civil War. I called it a pawn in the Civil War, in the chess game of the Civil War. And so I had a museum official tell me, because there was a lot of text, 4 huge interpretive panels. And he said, "Oh, nobody's going to stand there and read that. That it's like that's museums don't give you that much information. You need to condense that down." But we put them up anyway. And on numerous occasions, I'd visit the museum and stand in the background, and I'd watch visitors come in, and they stood there for 20, 30 minutes reading, learning about the history. And unfortunately, I've described, the damage that vandals and souvenir hunters had done to the lens. We really had hoped that the public, seeing that we have recovered the lens, we put it on display, that they would begin returning prisms. I actually think so. Over 600 prisms are missing. I think most of those 600 prisms are probably within just a few miles of the modern Cape Hatteras lighthouse.
Well, they're probably living on that island for sure.
Yeah. We know of a few families, and they feel like it belongs to them because their ancestors were the keepers of the lighthouse. So it wasn't. I kind of was too optimistic thinking that people would start returning artifacts, which by the way remains to be federal property. But and then I've even suggested that we offer an amnesty program and even pay a small fee or something to have prisms returned so we could get more of the lens back. So it sat there, the lens from 2007 to just about a year or two ago. The main exhibition portion of that museum was unfinished. Okay, all of the money that we had raised to build we spent it just to build the museum. It's an amazing building, built to withstand Category 5 hurricanes, and but then a couple of years ago, and I've since left the board of directors of the museum. The museum was able to receive a grant of $5.1 million to install, and complete the main exhibition hall. And it was decided to move the lens from the lobby into the main exhibition hall, which is, granted, it's climate controlled. It's a much better environment for the lens for it to last a long time. And so the state of North Carolina hired a exhibit designer, and they spent a couple of years working on this. And I think it cost $80,000 to dismantle and then reassemble the lens in the main exhibition hall. I bet you General Meade would have liked to have been able to be paid $80,000, for.
Hell yeah. I wonder if he made that during the war, in the 4 years of war service. I wonder if he made that at all. Probably not.
Probably not. So I was really anxious to see how the lens was going to be interpreted in its new setting. And so last May, I was able to go to the museum and walk in there. And I cannot tell you how disappointed I was to, first of all, see the lens was in positioned around a bunch of other artifacts that had nothing to do with lighthouses or lighthouse lenses. I think there was some scuba gear and some, it's just really random stuff. And then the interpretive sign. So we went from the 4 panels that I had written that explained the history of the lens, which at that time wasn't even sufficient because I didn't even know about the Crystal Palace,
Right.
And all of that interpretive information has since been reduced to 5 words. There's a small card in front of the lens, and 2 of the words are not even factually correct. So, it's really disappointing. There was a time when, the media has changed a lot in the last 20 years or so, but there was a time when local media or a reporter with, real journalistic chops would have written about this and done some, to try to generate some public pressure to correct this, because that lens, it's the most historic lighthouse lens in America, and its history has been reduced to 3 of 5 words. So, I don't know what's going to happen about that. They're out of money in terms of making any changes or improvements or whatever.
I'll tell you, Kevin, I'm glad you brought this up because, in the time we first spoke when we were talking piracy to now, the museum was open. It closed for these renovations and had since reopened. So I got to go back down. I got to see this in person for myself. We hadn't spoken for quite some time at that point. So I was just kind of riding this experience with like a complete lack of bias or anything. And I found, as we were talking about in pre-production, I found there were 2 things that stuck out to me. I thought it was a beautiful museum. I thought they did a really good job considering I work in a small museum environment. And when you have so many stories to tell, you just got to do your best, right? And I thought they did a good job. However, I immediately noticed this just sort of random placement and this complete lack of interpretation, which I found to be very interesting when you consider that the focus of the museum being the graveyard of the Atlantic, and you saying that, we're talking about like relics in there that are relevant to the graveyard of the Atlantic. I mean, obviously I understand the public interest in things like World War II related, which is why they have the very robust, look at the Enigma machine and things like that. But I mean, the Fresnel lens is like the biggest thing literally and also significantly that is relative to the story of the graveyard of the Atlantic, the way they're telling it, which is it's all centered around shipwrecks. And the purpose of this light was to keep those from happening and things like that. So I immediately said, wow, I said, it's cool. I like it. Like it visually minus the stuff around it. I was like, neat. But I was like, this tells no story. I said it directly to my wife. And then I was having a conversation later. And again, I'm bad. I'm great with dates. I'm bad with names, so forgive me. But I was speaking to one of the, directors in the museum, and they had I said, how do people feel about the interpretation? And she said, well, we've heard from the guy that wrote the previous things, and he's not thrilled. And I said, without giving anything away, I said, I'm sure, because I already knew that you had put in an incredible amount of work, and there was passion behind this. So I was wondering how you felt about it. And then my second, not a question, but the question I want to ask is, what can we do? Like, what can we do here on our podcast? What can people do to just like help either come to the story of the lens, because they're not going to get it at that museum. And I don't want to say that as a direct shot at the museum, but like, you're not going to get this full story. How can we do something to help people reach it other than just listening to our show and reading your books? Which buy Kevin's books, God damn it.
That's it. That's it.
Buy Kevin's book.
Story, all the history's in there. I don't know. I actually I didn't communicate directly with the folks at the museum. So if they said that they've heard from me, I think I have posted a lot of stuff on my Facebook page about it, and they obviously must.
Maybe that was the grapevine they got a little bit of there.
I don't know. I mean, I know how the state works, and I know funding for museums, and I know that there's, they're not going to move the lens. They, and I don't know if they have the money, to sort of redesign the exhibit around it. But it's So as I've said to you, it's the damage. So it's remarkable, I think, first of all, that the lens was, depending on which side of the war you were on, it was either stolen or it was, stolen by Confederates, or the Confederates said, hey, it was ours. We just decided to relocate it.
They were protecting it.
But it was rumored during the war that Confederates were damaging or vandalizing lighthouse lenses, which they weren't. So it's one of the ironies of this story that it was actually the descendants of the lighthouse keepers who polished the lens and took care of the lens and and made sure that the light was lit every night and loved the lighthouse. And they were the ones to, to damage, the lens itself. But there's more than one type of damage that can be done to a historic artifact, as you know. I mean, you can physically damage it, but you can also damage it by not properly and sufficiently relating its history.
Yeah,
So
the memory's under attack in a way right now, right?
Right. It's a new form of vandalism in a way, and so I don't know. I think this your podcast will help get the word out. I think as people maybe visit the museum and they go, "Oh my God, what are you doing? I mean, why isn't this history told properly?" That may help. Pardon me?
Are we at liberty to say what those 5 words are?
Yeah, we are.
We are at liberty. Do we know them? I don't know. I might have a photograph of it, to be honest.
I have, I think while we're talking, if I can talk at the same time, and then, because I know I posted it on my Facebook page, it actually described the lens as, dated 1850, which wasn't correct. Mm-hmm. And,
well, I'll tell you, one of the biggest things people can do to get involved is get involved directly with the museums. Find out how you can donate your time, donate your money in ways that are meaningful, and go to the museums, that go to the projects relative to this. Don't just blindly donate to whatever, because, organizations are doing so many things that money might go somewhere else. But small museums all need your help. They all need donations, time, things like that. So what you might want to do is just get involved at the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum. And as we say, here and there on the show, it might sound cheesy, but be that change you want to see. You want to hear that story, go to the museum and ask about that story. Ask how you can help, whatever it is. Kevin, here's what I'm going to do. When I go down to see my folks this year, the entire week, I'll go spend an hour a day at the museum. I'll just stand in front of the lighthouse and interpret it for you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
I'll be like, who the hell is this guy? I'll be like, just trust me, I'm allowed to be here.
And yes, and there's one last, I know we may be wrapping this up, but there's one last part of the story that I wanted to share with you. I mentioned that I had a great grandfather who almost certainly saw the lens at the Crystal Palace in 1853. But when I was working on this book and doing the research, I had to research very deeply, Civil War history. And if you know the history of the coast of North Carolina in the summer of 1861, you know that General Butler was sent down to North Carolina to capture 2 Confederate forts that were located at Hatteras Inlet. The forts were called Fort Clark, which was a small fortification that was closer to the beach, and then another Fort Hatteras, which was kind of on the backside of the island. And so this operation was conceived, and I can't remember. I'm a little fuzzy on the facts, but a number of very large Union warships and thousands of troops were sent down to Hatteras Inlet. They arrived around August 27th of 1861, and for the purpose of, first of all, bombarding the 2 forts. And at the same time, the Union leaders wanted to land an amphibious force on the beach for the purpose of attacking Fort Clark from the landward side. And as I'm reading this history, I noticed that one of the units of this amphibious landing force was Company G of the 9th New York Volunteers. Well, as soon as I saw that, alarm bells went off in my head.
Right.
Company G, 9th New York Volunteers. It's like, boy, I remember there's something about my family and my family's past, and something about a possession that I have that has something to do with the 9th New York Volunteers. It was a memento that I acquired when I was very young, probably 5 or 6 years old. And at the time, fortunately, my father was still alive. But I was going through an old shoebox, and I found that memento, and here it is.
Look at that.
This is a
that's a reunion pin.
protected. It is a reunion medallion.
I'm glad that the pin
or
says that, because as soon as you said 9th New York, I was like, isn't that Hawkins Wavs? Because those guys have a monument up here on Antietam Battlefield. Is your ancestor a veteran of Antietam Battlefield?
Yes.
Holy moly.
But before he ended up at Antietam, he was sent to Cape Hatteras. Company G was led by this Captain Jardine. By the way, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but on the back is etched a name. It says M. O'Brien.
I can see the beginning of O'Brien.
Okay. So I didn't know who M. O'Brien was, but I had this in a shoebox. So I contacted my father, and he said, well, your grandmother gave that to you when you were very young. She said that belonged to her grandfather. Her grandfather was named Michael O'Brien. And so I asked my dad, I said, well, what do we know about Michael O'Brien? He goes, well, we don't know much of anything. So being the researcher that I am, I said, well, I'm going to find out.
Yeah.
And so I did a deep dive and discovered that Michael O'Brien, my great-great-grandfather, was 18 years old in the summer. Well, actually, he was in the spring of 1861. He was 17 years old. He and his older brother, who was a year older, had just moved from Ireland to New York City, and they were looking for work. And just so happened that
President Lincoln said, I got some work for you, Patty.
I got a job for you.
Yeah, I got one for you, Patty.
I got a job for you.
Yeah.
So exactly. So the story goes that I've learned from a distant relative that Timothy O'Brien, the older brother, enlisted in the 9th New York Volunteers. Rush Hawkins had his recruiting office was near Washington Square in Manhattan, and but the older brother told my great-great-grandfather, whatever you do, I do not want you to join up. I don't want you to enlist. He said, our family only needs one of us to go fight the war. And so Timothy O'Brien, they shipped him off to Fort Monroe, Virginia. And my great-great-grandfather, of course, that summer turned 18, and immediately after he turned 18, he went to the 9th New York office at Washington Square, and he enlisted. And supposedly, he got then shipped down to Fort Monroe. He walked off the ship, went down the dock, and found his brother. And his brother ran up, and they got into a fist fight. And the older brother beat the crap out of my great-great-grandfather.
As the Irish do.
That was the worst that he was injured in the entire war. Was at the hands of his own brother.
That's lucky. That's a bit lucky.
But they were both, well, he actually, at Antietam, he had a shell burst near his head, and he lost hearing in one ear, because I've got his pension records and everything. But both brothers were then assigned to Company G of the 9th New York, and who were then assembled on a ship for this mission to attack a southern state, which happened to be North Carolina. It happened to be Hatteras Island. And they were both part of the landing force. They were among the first 80 Yankees to land on the beach at Hatteras. They weren't very well prepared for coming in on rafts or boats or whatever they used.
No, they were not.
The surf at that particular time was very high, and they all got tossed in the water. All their ammunition got wet. They clung to their muskets, but then they assembled on the beach, soaking wet. The next thing that happened was, and they could see Fort Clark off in the distance, and that was their objective, and they were going to march down there and attack the Confederates in Fort Clark. But all of a sudden, they saw what looked to them to be a Confederate cavalry running at them full speed, running up the beach, all these horses. Meanwhile, the Union ships offshore are just lobbing shell after shell into the forts. There are all these explosions, there's smoke, there's just chaos. And this cavalry comes running up, and they run right by them. And it turns out to just be a bunch of Outer Banker ponies that were spooked by the explosions of, the cannon fire.
I literally was going to ask if they were the ponies on the. They're like, the horses are like, what the hell is this? They didn't just run it up.
I know. They ran right by them. So that was a big moment of relief for my great-great-grandfather and his fellow soldiers in the Company G. But they succeeded in actually capturing and occupying Fort Clark, and they spent that first night in there. The Union Navy actually retreated offshore because, of course, being close to the beach in a large ship off of, in the graveyard of the Atlantic is a very dangerous place to be.
Terrible idea.
So they did report that it was a very uneasy night because the Confederates in Fort Hatteras were only like a few hundred yards away, and but they didn't bother each other. And then, of course, the next day, the Union forces subdued Fort Hatteras, and the Confederates all surrendered. And my great-great-grandfather remained there for the rest of the year. Rush Hawkins actually was returned north, but Captain Jardine and my great-great-grandfather's company stayed there all the way up until the General Burnside showed up in January of 1862 to attack Roanoke Island. In fact, my great-great-grandfather's company captured a gun battery on Roanoke Island, which is, and I know you're familiar with it, but there's that intersection where Highway 64 and then the old Business 64 goes into the town of Manio. That intersection, if you go through there, then you go out to the beach, the causeway or whatever. Well, that's where that gun battery was located. So every time I drive through there, I think of my great-great-grandfather. But I have reason to believe when General Butler, accomplished his mission and then he left, Rush Hawkins and the 9th New York were the commanding force holding Fort Hatteras Island. And Colonel Hawkins' favorite company was Company G. Well, Hawkins was given orders from Lincoln to find out why the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was not functioning. Why was it not operating? And so a detachment of soldiers, and I have no proof except my innate feelings that Company G was the one that was sent up there because they were the sort of the SEAL team, SEAL Team 6 of that time.
You've got a pretty good track record of intuition at this point. I will just say that. So, I'll take you at your word for now.
It's a strange thing to think of this, that my great-great-grandfather was among those first soldiers to discover that the lens for the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was missing. And then 140 years later, his great-great-grandson is the one who locates it.
Yeah, you're not even the first person in your own family to look for this light. Think about that.
Right, exactly.
That's awesome.
Right.
Generations apart, you're another person in your bloodline looking for this light.
Right, and have found it.
That's incredible.
Now I have to say that I've heard through the grapevine that the National Park Service is saying that I didn't find it. They knew where it was all along, but they didn't know any of the history. They didn't know, of course, that it was, on display at the Crystal Palace in New York City. There it was seen by over 1 million people before it ever got into a lighthouse. So what a remarkable story, and I'm real proud to have been able to.
And you should be, Kevin, because when we released our Blackbeard episode, one of my closest friends said to me, he's like, "What is this guy?" He's like, "Is this guy fucking Indiana Jones?" He's like, "You got to ask him." And I said, "Yeah, dude, he kind of gives me that vibe. He's like, you said it right. You step through the pages of history and become part of the story." And it was cool when. And I gotta say, it was cool when the previous episode we did started with you riding in a car with the bones of Edward Salter. This episode started a little less macabre. So I gotta say, I don't know if disappointed's the right word, but that you started with bones in your car in the last episode, and I was like, that's so rad. But it was just the Indiana Jones concept of it is just so wild, and it's not once but twice in your career, you have immersed yourself so much into the search for just what was truth, I guess we can call it, right? And then you become a part of the discovery, a part of the future of how we understand these truths. And that's like striking historical gold once with Blackbeard and then yet again with the Lighthouse, dude. I mean, that's incredible. So you should be proud of that.
Well, I don't do this. I haven't done this to get wealthy by any means. And, you'll never get wealthy or rich writing books, unless you're Dan Brown or, but if I can get anything out of this, it's that if I can inspire just one young person, to get excited about this, and my advice to them is, first of all, don't believe what you read anywhere. You need to prove these things to yourself. And there's so much about our history or our past that's so badly distorted. I didn't set out to be a myth buster, but every subject that I take up, I discover things that people don't know. And by the way, since the last time we did a podcast, this is actually my latest book, which is about the colonial era Charleston Lighthouse. And boy, that's it's hard for a North Carolinian to go down to Charleston and tell them that they don't know anything about their history.
I'm sure you love doing that. I'm not sure they loved that happening to them.
No, I have not. I have not been particularly well received down there, but they finally beginning to make some headway. But the reason why I'm even bringing this up is that book has also a Civil War component to it, and that lighthouse had a very rare second order lens. I'll just tell this very quickly.
Sure.
But the same process happened. By the way, Charleston in South Carolina, as we know, they started the Civil War, but they were way ahead of everybody else. They had already disabled the lens in January of 1861, well before they even seceded from the Union. But eventually that lens was also removed from the lighthouse. This was a colonial era lighthouse built in 1768. Very amazing story that nobody knew about until I researched that story. But that lens was put on a train with the bells from St. Michael's Church in Charleston, very famous church, and shipped up to Columbia because they thought Columbia would be a safe place to store the lighthouse lens and the bells from St. Michael's Church. The lighthouse, the Capitol building at the time was a wooden structure in Columbia, and but it had a basement, and I believe that the lens from the Charleston Lighthouse was stored down in the basement. The bells of the church were stored in an outbuilding, but as we well know, Columbia was not a safe place to keep anything.
Nope.
And that lens did in fact disappear from history because I believe it melted
in the fire.
The Capitol building in the fire. The heat was so high, and it was never found. I think that it was just returned to, molecules of silicon and or in the earth beneath the State House that's there today.
So very familiar with St. Michael's Church. In my professional world, working in the 18th century, working in the sort of land between the French and Indian War and the War of Independence, I get to focus a lot on Maryland's direct role in those stories, and you end up following the family with the last name Gist, things like that, and you end up following eventually to this guy Mordecai Gist, who was one of the brigadier generals in Washington's army. He's buried in the churchyard there at St. Michael's. So here's me finally in Charleston a few years ago. I'm like, I'll get to go pay my respects to this Marylander. I'll get to go see his grave. It's the one day I'm in Charleston in like a decade. Is also the same day that like some politician in South Carolina's like legacy of just awesome people died, and his funeral is that day, and it's being held at that church. God. So I can't get within like 10 blocks of St. Michael's. I'm like, all right, well, that was a great tourist idea. So, I'm having a bad time in Charleston too, Kevin. That's what I'm saying.
The remarkable thing about the St. Michael's church and this particular lighthouse, this lighthouse was designed by the same architect and builder of St. Michael's Church. And this is the only lighthouse in America that actually was built like a church steeple, because that's all he knew how to build. He built this lighthouse a few years after he completed St. Michael's Church, but it's another remarkable story. And I'll leave you with this one other thing. I've been commissioned. Now, you go to the Outer Banks. There are two places where you can pass a historical marker dedicated to a man named Reginald Fessenden. And I have been, over the last year, commissioned by a group of North Carolina broadcasters to research the Reginald Fessenden story. But he's considered by many to be the father of radio.
Yep.
And once again, I've done a very, very deep dive, and most of what people believe about Reginald Fessenden is not true or not accurate. So I've got that'll be one of my forthcoming books. And yet again, I'm going to be annoying people and institutions and government agencies, because they're either going to have to ignore me or they're going to have to change their historical interpretation.
Do the good work, Kevin. Sorry, Parker, go ahead.
I was just saying, do we have an Abner Doubleday situation on our hands?
Yeah, that's right. So, Kevin, couple things here. I want to ask a question about the body light, and then I want to ask a World Wars question just to kind of preview what I think I want to talk to you about the next time we have you back. Relative to the body island light, my brain is telling me that not only was that light removed, but that tower was destroyed. or at least partially destroyed. Is that accurate? Because I know that
Yeah.
they removed the light from the Hatteras, but the tower remains. Don't they just take out the Body Island light entirely at one point?
You are correct. The Confederate troops were not given those orders or instructions. They kind of took that upon themselves to blow up the lighthouse, and it was partly because they were pissed off because they were retreating. They had marched down toward Hatteras. It's a very famous episode in North Carolina Civil War history called the Chickamauga Races.
Yep.
And their plan was actually to damage or destroy the Cape Hatteras lighthouse, and actually the 9th New York Volunteers were part of the defensive forces that turned them back and forced them to march back up to the north end of the island, where they filled that lighthouse with black powder. And it would have taken a substantial amount of that, by the way. There are a number of other instances where other lighthouses, even in the Revolutionary War, were attempted to be destroyed or blown up. And they were so stoutly built, with walls 5-6 feet thick. I mean, in some instances, thicker than forts. But in that instance, yes, they blew up the Body Island Lighthouse. Now, this I can share with you that you probably don't know, because I was curious as to where. So the Body Island Lighthouse was actually in 1861 on the north end of Hatteras Island.
Okay.
Okay. So the current Body Island Lighthouse is on the south end of Body Island, which is now part of the landmass that includes Nag's Head. So I went and found a 1858 coastal survey map, and then I used that and used Photoshop, and I aligned that with some modern maps. And there was one island that's off in the sound there called Duck Island, and it hasn't changed in shape or position in well over 100 years. And so I aligned those two, and then I could immediately see where the Body Island Lighthouse, and actually there was also a Confederate gun battery next to that location.
Okay.
The Confederates spiked the guns. I think they spiked like 16 guns, and they were left there. So somewhere in the ocean off that beach are probably 16 guns from the war. But I was stunned to discover, so the inlet back then, the north end of Hatteras Island, is where the campground is, immediately across from the marina, the Oregon Inlet Marina. So now it's on the north side of the inlet, whereas in the war it was on the south side of the inlet. But the inlet has moved, and so I've tried to inform a few people that, because when that lighthouse came down, the top of the lighthouse was iron. It was a iron lantern, just like all other lighthouses. This big glass and iron sort of bird cage at the top with an iron roof, and also the pedestal, the cast iron pedestal of that. It was Body Island had a third order lens, and when that lighthouse came down, the lens had been removed, but the pedestal was still up there. And all of that is probably a few hundred yards off the beach at the Oregon Inlet Campground. And so it's not an easy place to go, searching with a magnetometer, though, because the surf is so rough at that point. But, anyway, that kind of fills that in. That lens, the Body Island Lighthouse, by the way, the lens was removed, and it was hidden at the Customs House in Elizabeth City at the beginning of the war. But it was one of the lenses that was found by Sherman's Signal Corps in the Capitol building in downtown Raleigh at the end of the war.
Let me ask you about the other lighthouse that's near and dear to me, the Ocracoke light. I feel like it's a significant, insignificant light when you're talking about it relative to like the Hatteras light. Like it's a much lower light. I feel like it's not as bright. But I'm not a lighthouse expert. So is that another one of those darkened lights? They take the lens out type of thing?
Yeah, the Ocracoke lens was taken out the same time the Cape Hatteras lens, and it was also taken up to the town of Washington. There's a funny episode that I discovered in reading letters at the National Archives, a couple of letters from the keeper of the Ocracoke Lighthouse, who remained on duty. So the lens was removed, but he stayed on duty at the lighthouse for a number of months. And so he wrote letters to the governor of North Carolina asking to be paid for the time that he spent serving the Confederacy. And then after Ocracoke Island was occupied by Union forces, he then sent a letter to the Lighthouse Bureau in Washington, D.C., asking for pay from them. And neither of them, of course, you know,
The
paid
man's
him.
just trying to do his job, Kevin. Somebody's got to pay this guy.
I know. It's pretty funny. And by the way, the keeper also, and you'll maybe appreciate this episode, but I discovered other letters pertaining to William Seward, of course, Lincoln's Secretary of State, sent a letter to the head of the Lighthouse Bureau asking him for the name and address of the keeper of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse who was on duty when the lens was removed. And of course, it's been famously said that Seward used to boast that he could ring a little bell and cause the arrest of a citizen. And so actually the letter originated from Seward's law firm in New York City, but they were seeking the name and address of the keeper of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse for the purpose of arresting him or prosecuting him for participating in the theft of federal property. Well, it just so happened I researched the keeper, who was, by the way, the great-great-grandfather of the keeper who was polishing the lens in the National Geographic photograph. But he evacuated not too long after he helped remove the lens. He moved over to the county across Pamlico Sound, which just coincidentally is called Hyde County, a good place to hide.
Yeah.
But he was never, William Seward and his law firm never tracked down Keeper Fulcher, so he survived the war.
Oh, it was one of the Fulchers? It was one of the Fulcher family?
Yes.
He's one of the there's a bunch of legacy families that are still on the island or were on the island for a very long time. So that's a name I'm very familiar with.
Well, and when you go to Cape Hatteras, you drive into Buxton, and then the road makes this kind of bend to the left, and there's a cemetery on the side of the road, and Benjamin Fulcher is buried in that cemetery. I've visited all these people that I write about and study or whatever. I always go to visit their graves. For example, the Washington physician, Dr. David T. Tayloe, is buried at the Episcopal Church cemetery in the town of Washington. And one of the great, there's so many things I could share with you, but a lot of good things happen when you discover something like this, and a lot of people contact you. But the Washington physician who transported the lens all the way up to Townsville and Hibernia Plantation, his name was Dr. David T. Tayloe. And about the time that I was working on this book, I got to meet Dr. David T. Tayloe, but he was Dr. David T. Tayloe IV.
Oh.
And he was the great grandson, and I have a photograph somewhere of I was able to. So after I found the lens, and then I published the book, and I went on a book tour and book signings or whatever, the Park Service allowed me to travel with a prism from the lens, and I have a photograph of me holding the prism with Dr. David T. Tayloe IV standing next to him. And I looked at him and said, "I'm not going to let you hold it, though, because the last time a member of your family had anything to do with this." I know, yeah,
it took a walk.
That's
funny.
He was a great guy. So it's a lot of fun. There are moments like that really make it rewarding.
I've only done what you're kind of describing in a very small and local sense. Just tracking down a humble militia soldier and a baker who's relative to the place that I work at on a daily basis, and just kind of following the maps, the county records, the land, everything, just to kind of figure out like where he physically existed on planet Earth relative to me. Like that's literally still one of the most fulfilling experiences of my career. So like listening to your stories, just like these are the things that you want to talk about inspiring a kid, dude. I'm almost 40. You're inspiring me just to keep doing my job. It's hard to be a park ranger right now. Thank God I don't work for the federal system.
Right.
So I'm very like, not that I ever really go through, dips where I'm like really feeling the lows, but like, it's the winter. There's not a lot going on with what I do, but like, I'm ready. Like it's winter as of recording. Kevin, I might not have told you, this is our annual beach visit. So this will be coming out when it's 100 degrees. People are going to the Outer Banks and thinking about it.
You may not know this, but I'm actually in the Great Balsam Mountains of southwestern North Carolina, but right now I'm at 4,000 feet, and there's snow in the forecast in a couple of days.
Yeah,
up
last
here,
time we
so-
caught up with you, you were hanging out at Governor Eden's estate along the
Yes.
the
Yes.
Bath Creek down there.
Bath Creek, exactly. So this is my home up in the mountains of North Carolina. So it's the climate here is, well, the mountain I'm on goes up to 6,000 feet. So up there at 6,000 feet, the climate is equal to southern Canada.
Yeah, you're getting snow.
Right, exactly.
Crazy.
So what was your question about World War II?
So here's all right. This is something I think that I accidentally did the first time, and now I think I want to do just every time. So I read Warzone over the summer. We did a lot of work with World War II in our last season, season 5. We did 2 juggernaut episodes on kind of just covering the Pacific, and then the ETO plus the African theaters, and we touch on the U-boat war. We do touch on the Hatteras connections because I'm one of those people that if it's relative to something that I can touch in my life, I want to talk about it. So it came up. But I think I want to do an episode where we just really talk about the World War or the World Wars on Hatteras. And I didn't know if you had a preference. Do you think our listeners would be better served talking about both World Wars in one episode, or do you think there's enough material to break up like the U-boat wars into 2 chats, the World Wars at Hatteras, but 2 episodes, Kevin?
I don't know if there's enough on World War I to fill, let's say, a 2-hour episode. Although I think one of the greatest stories of the 2 world wars is a book I featured in a book titled "Into the Burning Sea," which was an event that took place in World War I in August of World War I. I've characterized it as the greatest Coast Guard rescue in history, and a past commandant of the Coast Guard not only agreed with me, but he endorsed the back cover of my book. It's an unbelievable story of how 6 men launched a surf boat to go out to aid 51 British sailors who were aboard a gasoline tanker that was torpedoed by a German U-boat in World War I.
Right.
Just 5 miles off the beach there at the village of Rodanthe. And that surf boat disappeared into flames and smoke, and was missing for 4 hours. And they came out 4 hours later with 42 of the 51 British sailors aboard the ship. It's an amazing story. I would love to be able to talk about that.
Yeah.
World War II, as you know, if you've read my book Warzone, you know that is a massive chapter of American history. I do a lot of lectures. I just did one a couple of weeks ago, and I've actually started sharing actual interviews with the men and women who were alive and witnessed the U-boat war in 1942, which I enjoy doing. But one year I was in the town or village of Pinehurst, which is noted for it being a golf course community in North Carolina. But I spoke to a group of retired military officers, and they wanted me to do a program on Warzone, World War II. And simply as a way to create a little humor at the beginning of my lecture, I said, I'm curious because you can't talk about how our U.S. Navy was totally unprepared to deal with German U-boats in 1942, when in fact we already had learned that lesson in World War I. It's you can't tell that story without sounding critical of the United States Navy. So at this lecture, I began by saying, well, before I begin, I'm just curious, knowing that you're all retired military officers, how many Navy admirals are in the room? And five hands went up, and one of them was a 3-star or 3-star. He was a vice admiral. And I went, oh boy, here we go. It's like they're gonna run me out of the room here. But I gave the lecture, and it was very well appreciated. And when it was over with, this woman came up to me. She was in civilian clothes, but she introduced herself as a Navy captain, and she said, "I am a professor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis." And I went, "Okay." And she goes, "And I have to tell you that I've never heard this before. We don't teach this. We don't teach this history."
Well, yeah, Kevin, this is America. We don't talk about when we lose or do bad. That's not how we teach ourselves. God.
Right. So, And that just brings to mind very quickly too, at the beginning of, not too long after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt appointed Admiral Ernest King to become the chief of the United States Navy. And you know how our armed forces love their acronyms, right? We put acronyms on everything.
Oh, yeah.
And so when he took office, he decided, so he's commander in chief of U.S. Naval Forces. So his office, he decided to go by the name CINCUS. Now pronounce that.
No, I don't want to do that. Do it one more time.
Cincus.
Cincus.
CINCUS. Cincus.
That's a great acronym for the Navy.
Well, somebody pointed out to him that probably sounded like an invitation to the Germans and the Japanese.
They were like, all right, we're in.
Do that very thing.
Yeah.
So they very quickly, within a couple of weeks, they changed it to COMINCH, Commander in Chief. And there's no telling how much we spent in having to change all the stationery and everything.
What an American thing. What an American thing. They're like, listen, guys, we're losing the war. It has nothing to do with strategy, tactics, technology, none of that. Do you see the acronym we're using for this commander? This is why we're losing. Like, that's why. Jesus. All right, so I think what we'll do, Kevin, is we'll focus on World War II because that seems to be where the meat of the World War story is, but we'll get that episode started with talking about the Merlot and just, sort of how that's the background and the lessons that should have been learned and were learned and kind of maybe put aside for the 42 conversation, just because after reading Warzone, I was like, you really only get the story of the Bedfordshire and you have to, go to a few places to get it, but you don't realize like how many times that the citizens of the Outer Banks could stand upon the beach and literally just watch ships going up, flames, seeing U-boats getting hit, and just like, I mean, it's so much more than just that one shipwreck. I'm sorry, not that. I don't want to call it a shipwreck, but that one lost ship.
Bedfordshire,
right. Right. So I just was like, man, there's such a bigger story that I don't feel like the average visitor to the park, to the beach, to the islands, I feel like they just miss because they only get the Bedfordshire one.
Right. And by the way, I've interviewed 3 of the men who buried Lieutenant Thomas Cunningham at that cemetery on Ocracoke, who were there. But, I've talked to, especially when I talk to women, I go, they said, well, what's this book, Warzone? I said, well, it's about World War II and German U-boats. And they go, oh, I'm not interested in that. I said, well, let me tell you how the book begins. It begins about a story about a 28-year-old woman whose ship is torpedoed on Palm Sunday. And she is 8.5 months pregnant and gets into a lifeboat with 20 strangers and goes into labor.
Right.
And in the middle of the night gives birth to a baby boy.
Yeah.
And so that's what the book has, those types of stories in there. I don't talk about tactics and, or at least that much, but
Hollywood, Kevin, Hollywood has kind of done us a disservice in the sense that it's made war all about John Wayne style stuff and not so much about the people experiences. Like it's not just about the U-boat sinking the Bedfordshire. It's like they're taking out civilian vessels. That's the way that book starts. Is honestly, it's insane. I mean, Dad, just think about, like, I have 2 children. Their births were very different. They were both very big deals in very different ways, and they were both done in hospitals with not a lot of danger, much less, here's your child being born on a life raft on the open ocean. Like, what?
With sharks circling, yes.
Right, like what? Like it's nuts. So all right, so we'll do that. So when we have you back, we'll go to World War II. The Merlot is my favorite U-boat story on the island. It's how I came to even discovering you as a writer. Was I picked up Into the Burning Sea? I do believe from the Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum like a while ago. Happened to be an autographed copy, so legendary pickup on my part, I might say. I literally didn't even register till I got home. It had this little gold sticker. It said autographed by the author.
Oh, but I can personalize it to you.
You should. No,
that was to meet up someday.
That's what I was going to say. Is we got to better coordinate when I come down to the island, because I have like a NASA sized landing window. Like I only come down for like a week, 10 days a year, and it's a crapshoot with working with my work schedule. So This summer, what I'll do is I'll
Down
reach out to you about a month ahead of time and say, hey, I'm coming down, and maybe we can work it out.
I bet you live closer to Cape Hatteras than I do, and I'm in North Carolina.
I
For
am.
me, it's a 12-hour drive from here for me.
I am 100% a closer drive for you. I'm about, I'd say I used to be 5.5 hours. I'm probably closer to 7 now once we moved and bought my house where it is. It's a little further in the sticks in Maryland than I used to live. That's because you have to go lateral and then down. I just have to go this awkward down path. 95, baby. I just got to get on 95 for a long time. All right, look.
It always surprises people when I tell them that the westernmost point in North Carolina is farther west than Detroit, Michigan.
Is it really?
Think about that. Yes.
A huge state.
No, I know that, but I never really thought about that. Do you guys get into Central Time Zone in North Carolina?
It's right across the border in Tennessee.
Man, that's crazy. You're that far west.
Yep.
Wild. All right, Kevin. Well, look, we're not going to go 2 years before we have you back on the show.
Sure.
I think what I'd like to do is maybe catch up with you once a year or so, just because our listeners deserve it, quite frankly. You're a fantastic storyteller. Pick up his book, Into the Burning Sea. Pick up the book, A War Zone. I'm blanking. What's the book relative to this? The Lighthouse.
The Lost
Light. Oh, my God.
Civil War mystery.
Pick it up.
Just say that, I don't know if you'll put this on the screen, but if anybody wants to contact me, don't buy the book through Amazon because I've got an issue with them, but they can email me at kevin@thelostlight.com. Simply kevin@thelostlight.com.
We'll put that up. You make sure you buy it directly from the guy who did all the work himself.
Yes, thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming on and telling us another banger of a story. It's been an absolute pleasure for myself to personally listen to it. I know our listeners are going to have a great time. We're looking forward to having you back soon. For our listeners out there, there's a lot coming up. The summer has been absolutely crazy. Parker and I have been very busy. From the field was a lot. We've put out a ton of stuff in our July Blitz. And guess what, guys? As the summer starts to wind down now, we're heading into fall, and there's even more gas in the tank. We're coming at you with another round of fastballs, some more baseball conversation, some spooky stuff. That's why I said I was kind of disappointed that we didn't start with Bones in this episode, Kevin, because, as summer ends, my mind immediately goes towards Halloween. And I was like, Edward Salter was in your car. So anyway, guys, look, keep up with the History Things podcast on our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram pages. Make sure you go to, Kevin, you do have a writer's page on Facebook, yes?
Yes, just you can find me on Facebook. Yeah, and actually I put a lot of, you do personal stuff. It's all about history.
Yep, that's what I meant. So you can follow along with the work Kevin's doing and things like that. But guys, otherwise, it's been a blast talking to you again. For my co-host today, Parker Russell, for our guest, author Kevin Duffus, I'm Pat McGuire. This has been the History Things podcast saying we will catch you all later.